Hello again. Today, I'm going to read chapter 2 and possibly chapter 3 of A Diplomat in Japan from the 1921 first edition. However, I think I'm going to use the Kindle version, which I introduced in my previous video, the first one about A Diplomat in Japan. So you can find all the details there. It's basically very cheap. It's 146 or 7 yen, which I find incredibly cheap for a faithful reproduction of the first edition. Anyway, let's get to it, and I'm going to share the screen now. There we are. So you can see how it's structured here. A Diplomat in Japan, new in recent books, preface, which I read last time, contents I read last time, list of illustrations I read last time, and then we've got the main book. And last time I read chapter 1, appointment as student interpreter. Okay, so I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay, resuming now, chapter 2. You can see there on the screen, Yokohama Society, official and unofficial. And I think I'm going to make this as large as it can be. Whoops. Yes. All right. So here we go. Yokohama Society, official and unofficial, 1862. Whoops. Oh, I see. Okay. 3 years had now elapsed since the opening of the country to foreign trade in consequence of the treaties of 1858. And a considerable number of merchants had settled at the ports of Nagasaki and Yokohama. Hakodate, however, offered then as now few attractions to mercantile enterprise, and being far removed from the political center, shared very slightly in the uneasy feeling which prevailed elsewhere. At Nagasaki, most of the territorial nobles of Western Japan had establishments whither they sent for sale the rice and other produce received in payment of tribute from the peasants, and their retainers came into frequent contact with foreigners, whose houses they visited for the purchase of arms, gunpowder, and steamers. Some sort of friendly feeling thus sprang up, which was increased by the American missionaries who gave instructions in English to younger members of this class and imparted to them liberal ideas which had no small influence on the subsequent course of events. At Yokohama, however, the foreign merchants had chiefly to do with a class of adventurers destitute of capital and ignorant of commerce. Broken contracts and fraud were by no means uncommon. Foreigners made large advances to men of straw for the purchase of merchandise which was never delivered, or ordered manufactures from home on the account of men who, if the market fell, refused to accept the goods. That would now bring them in only a loss. Raw silk was adulterated with sand or fastened with heavy paper ties, and every separate skein had to be carefully inspected before payment, while the tea could not be trusted to be as good as the sample. Now and then, a Japanese dealer would get paid out in kind, but the balance of wrongdoing was greatly against the native, and the conviction that Japanese was a synonym for dishonest trader became so firmly seated in the minds of foreigners that it was impossible for any friendly feeling to exist. The custom house officials were in the highest degree corrupt and demanded ever-increasing bribes from the foreigners who sought to elude the import duties. One of the worst abuses was the importation of large quantities of wines, beer, spirits, and stores, for which exemption from the payment of duty was claimed as goods intended for personal use. The local administration was carried on by a large staff of officials established at the custom house. There were 2 bugyo or governors, 2 kumigashira or vice governors, 2 metsuke, whose function was that of keeping an eye on the doings of the others, a number of shirabe-yaku or directors and joyaku or chief clerks, besides a host of scribes, interpreters, tide waiters, and policemen in black or green robes. Tide waiters, wonderful word. Dutch was the common medium of communication, both orally and in writing, for English was as yet scarcely studied by the natives, and the foreigners who could speak Japanese might be counted on the fingers of one hand. Yet all knew a little. A sort of bastard language had been invented for the uses of trade in which the Malay words pegi and sarampan played a great part. And with the addition of anata and arimas, everyone fancied himself competent to settle the terms of a complicated transaction. In this new tongue, all the rich variety of Japanese speech by which the relative social position of the speakers is indicated and the intricate inflection of the verbs were conspicuous by their absence. Outside the settlements, it was, of course, not understood, and its use by Europeans must have contributed not a little to the contempt for the barbarian, which was characteristic of the native attitude towards foreigners. By virtue of the treaties, Kanagawa had been at first fixed upon for the residence of Europeans, but lying on the Tokaido, or principal highway between Yedo and Kyoto, it was only too well calculated to afford occasion for collision between the armed followers of the Japanese nobles and the foreign settlers. Early in the day, the tycoon's government sought to avoid this difficulty by erecting a custom house and rows of wooden bungalows at the fishing village of Yokohama across the shallow bay to the south. Some of the foreign representatives, more intent upon enforcing treaty provisions than desirous of meeting the convenience of the native officials and the European merchants, strongly opposed this arrangement, but the practical advantages of proximity to the anchorage and personal security won the favor of the merchants, and Yokohama became recognized as the port. Long after, and perhaps to this day, the foreign consuls continued to date their official reports from Kanagawa, though they were safely ensconced at the rival site, where a town of 100,000 inhabitants now exists, and curious stories are told of the difference in freight that used to be earned on goods shipped from Europe to Yokohama or Kanagawa, as the case might be. The foreign settlement, for greater security, was surrounded on the land side by wide canals across which bridges were thrown, while ingress and egress were controlled by strong guards of soldiers placed there with the double object of excluding dangerous characters and levying a tax on the supplies introduced from the surrounding country. At first, land was given away freely to all applicants, some of whom were employés of the different consulates. These latter afterwards sold their lots to new arrivals bent upon commercial pursuits, and thus pocketed gains to which they had no shadow of a right. When further additions were afterwards made to the settlement, precautions were taken which effectually prevented anyone, whether merchant or official, from obtaining land without paying an adequate price. Later on, title deeds were made out by which the ground was conveyed to the holders, their heirs, administrators, executors, and assigns, thus creating a form of property new to English experience, which purported to be at once real and personal. Streets were laid out with but little thought of the general convenience and slight provision for the future. The day of wheeled carriages had not dawned upon Japan. It was sufficient if space were left for handcarts, and the most important Japanese commercial town of the future was thus condemned in perpetuity to inconveniences of traffic, the like of which can be best appreciated by those who knew the central parts of business London 50 years ago, or the successive capitals of the Italian kingdom when they were raised to that rank. Architectural ambition at first was contented with simple wooden bungalows, and in the latter part of 1862, there were not more than half a dozen two-storied buildings in the foreign portion of the town. Behind the settlement lay a newly filled-in tract of ground known as the Swamp, still unoccupied except by a racecourse track, and in the rear of this, again, across a foul marsh, were conspicuous the flimsy buildings of the Yoshiwara, euphemistically described by a noble duke from his place in Parliament as an establishment for the education of young ladies, and where a colonial bishop, to the intense amusement of the younger and more irreverent of the foreign community, had innocently left his visiting card upon the elderly female who presided over the pleasures of the place. But in those days, all the residents were young. Gosh, this is actually quite funny. I hadn't realized. Two churches, however, had already been erected by Catholics and Protestants respectively, and a foreign cemetery had been set apart from on the outside of the settlement. The health enjoyed by the European and American inhabitants was such that the only occupants of the burial ground were some Russian officers and two Dutch merchant captains who had fallen victims to the deadly and mistaken patriotism of the Japanese samurai, two sordid men. No one had yet succumbed to disease in that beautiful sunny climate. The foreign community of Yokohama of that day was somewhat extravagantly described by an English diplomat, Sir Rutherford Alcock actually, as the scum of Europe. No doubt there was a fair sprinkling of men who, suddenly relieved from the restraints which social opinion places upon their class at home, and exposed to the temptations of Eastern life, did not conduct themselves with the strict propriety of students at a theological college. That they were really worse than their co-equals elsewhere is unlikely, but in a small community where the actions of everyone are semi-public and concealment is not regarded as an object of first-rate importance, the vices that elsewhere pass unnoticed become prominent to the eyes of those who are not exposed to the same temptations. There were also not a few who came there without much capital to make a livelihood, or, if possible, something more, and hastened to the attainment of their object without being troubled with much scruple. And the difficulty which soon presented itself of obtaining a sufficiency of native coin in exchange for the silver dollar of Eastern commerce was the cause of extravagant demands being presented to the Japanese treasury. But the compromise eventually arrived at, by which the merchant had to buy his ichibus in the open market, while the official obtained the equivalent of his salary and often much more in native coin, nearly weight for weight of his Mexicans, was to the minds of all unprejudiced persons a far greater scandal. Detractors said that the advantages thus given to ministers, consuls, sailors, and soldiers was a bribe to induce their compliance with violation of treaty stipulations to the prejudice of their non-official countrymen. But this is unfair. It was the result of false theories as to the nature and function of money, and personal interest worked against a conversion to views more in accordance with the principles of political economy. The fact, however, remains that in September 1862, the current rate of exchange was 214 ichibus for $100. That's ichibus in italics, by the way, though the latter were really exchangeable for 311 ichibus according to the treaty. Each diplomatic or consular establishment was allowed to exchange monthly a certain number of dollars, supposed to represent the total salaries of the staff and other government charges, 13 ichibus per $100 being deducted for coinage. An official whose salary was $100 received 298 ichibus, the surplus of which over his bazaar expenses he proceeded to change back into dollars. But practically he received $139.25, or a profit of nearly 40%. The gains of a minister whose salary was £3,000 a year, it may easily be seen, were very large. This was not all. The balance of the monthly quota of ichibus was then reconverted into dollars. The amount due to the official chest was deducted, and the profit then divided among the staff in proportion to their salaries. On a nominally small income, it was consequently possible to live well, keep a pony, and drink champagne. As time went on, the number of ichibus thus put into circulation increased, and the rate of exchange eventually declined to par. Then and only then the system was abandoned. Where the money came from that was thus transferred to the pockets of officials can be best explained by those who are versed in economical questions. For my own part, I cannot look back on that period without shame, and my only excuse, which is perhaps of little worth in the court of history, is that I was at the bottom of the ladder and received the proportion paid to me by those who were in charge of the business. A few words may be devoted to describing the Yokohama society of those days. There were few ladies in the settlement. Japan was a long way from Europe, with no regular steam communication, and the lives of foreigners were supposed to be not very safe at the hands of the arm-bearing classes. The two great China firms of Jardine, Matheson and Company and Dent and Company were, of course, represented. The latter came down with a crash a year or two after my arrival. Fletcher and Company, another important Shanghai firm, had a branch, and so had Barnett and Company, both now long forgotten. Most of the remainder were Japan firms, amongst whom Aspinall, Corns and Company, Macpherson, Marshall and Company were the foremost English, and Walsh, Hall and Company the leading American firms. Germans, French and Dutch were considered of no account, in inverted commas. Money was abundant, or seemed to be. Everyone kept a pony or two, and champagne flowed freely at frequent convivial entertainments. Races were held in the spring and autumn, and real horses competed in some of the events. That's real in inverted commas. A favorite Sunday's excursion was the ride along the Tokaido to Kawasaki for tiffin, that's a light lunch, and back again toward evening. Longer outings were to Kanazawa, Kamakura, and Enoshima, but anyone who had ventured as far as Hachioji or Hakone, which were beyond the treaty limits, was regarded as a bold, adventurous spirit. The privilege of traveling beyond a distance of 25 miles from Yokohama was reserved to the diplomatic representatives of foreign powers, and Yedo could be visited only in the disguise of a member of one of the legations with the permission of its head. Such favors were regarded with extreme jealousy by those who were debarred by circumstances from obtaining them, and loud murmurs were heard that it was the minister's duty to invite his countrymen to the capital and give them board and lodging, irrespective of the shape which their private relations with him might have assumed. Then, and perhaps even yet, there existed a theory that public servants were practically the servants of the extremely small section of the public that inhabited Yokohama. And when the servants failed to comply with the wishes of their employers, they were naturally and rightly abused behind their backs. So strong was the hostility excited in the breasts of the English, Scotch, Irish portion of the community by the unlucky phrase "scum of Europe," that no member of either legation or consulate of their country was allowed admittance into the Yokohama Club, composed chiefly of British merchants. And this feeling lasted until the year 1865 brought about a permanent change in the representation of Great Britain. The excuse for such relations between the British residents and one who ought to have been the leader of the small society is to be found in the comparative youthfulness and ignorance of the world which characterized the former. Ah, I see. So when Parkes arrived, when Alcock left and Parkes arrived, the situation changed, yes. The experience of men and manners which saves the dwellers in Little Pedlington from believing that others are deliberately plotting to inflict insults on them is seldom attained before middle life, especially when Little Pedlington happens to be located in an eastern land where the mind's growth comes to a standstill and a man's age is virtually to be reckoned by the years actually spent in the mother country. For all purposes of mental and moral development, the time passed on the opposite side of the world must be left out of the calculation. It was agreed in the treaties that Yedo should be the residence of the foreign diplomatic representatives, and 4 Buddhist monasteries had, in accordance with Japanese custom, been assigned to the representatives of the 4 chief powers, Great Britain, France, Holland, and the United States. Sir R. Alcock, that's Rutherford Alcock, occupied Tozenji in the suburb of Takanawa. Monsieur de Graef von Polsbroek lived in Cho-Oji, a little nearer the city. Then came Sai-Kaiji, the residence of Monsieur Duchesne de Belcourt, and Mr. Harris, that's Townsend Harris, had settled down at Zempukuji in Azabu. But a series of alarming occurrences had caused the European portion of the diplomatic body to transfer their quarters to Yokohama, and the American minister alone held out, declaring his confidence in the good faith of the Japanese government and their ability to protect him. In September of 1862, he had already been replaced by General Pruyn, P-R-U-Y-N. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Pruyn, who followed the example of his predecessor until eventually driven out of the capital by a fire which destroyed his house, whether purely accidental or maliciously contrived. The English legation in 1861 had been the object of a murderous attack in which the secretary, Mr. Lawrence Oliphant, and Mr. G.C. Morrison were wounded. The assailants were principally retainers of the daimyo of Mito, but others belonging to various clans were concerned in the affair, and some of these are still living. Sir Rutherford Alcock had consequently removed to Yokohama, where the strong guard placed by the Japanese government at the entrances to the town and the foreign men of war in the harbor offered sufficient guarantees for safety. On his quitting Japan for a term of leave early in 1862, his locum tenens, Colonel Neale, N-E-A-L-E, not believing in a danger of which he had no experience, brought the legation back to Tozenji. But he had no sooner installed himself there than an event occurred which led him to change his opinion. This was nothing less than the murder of the sentry who stood at his bedroom door and of a corporal on his rounds at the hands of one of the Japanese guard, in revenge for an insult offered to him, it is said, by the youngest member of the staff, a heedless boy of 15 or 16. So the British legation packed up their archives and hastened back to Yokohama, where they installed themselves in a house that stood on the site of the present Grand Hotel. This building belonged to an Englishman named Hoey, H-O-E-Y, who was murdered in his bed in 1870, apparently from motives of private revenge. The foreign consuls were all stationed at Yokohama, with the exception of the American consul, Colonel Fisher, who remained at Kanagawa. Mr. Harris, it is said, would never admit that Yokohama could be rightfully substituted for Kanagawa, the town mentioned in the treaty, and would not permit his consul to reside there. He even carried his opposition so far as to declare that he never would countenance the change of settlement, and carried out his vow by leaving Japan without having set foot in Yokohama. Then there's a note, note 1. Yes, I'm going to read that. Note 1. It would be inconvenient to observe chronological exactness in matters of official rank or title, which in the case of most individuals are subject to progression. I shall speak therefore of persons by the titles they bore at the latest portion of the period covered by these reminiscences. Continuing with the main text. At the time of my arrival there, Colonel Neil, an old warrior who had seen service with the Spanish Legion, commanded by Sir de Lacy Evans, and who, gossip said, regarded Sir Rutherford Alcock, formerly attached to the Marine Brigade of Portugal in the quality of surgeon with no friendly feelings, was Secretary of Legation and consequently chargé d'affaires in the absence of his chief. He had great command of his pen and composed most drastic notes to the Japanese government, some of which have been printed by my friend Mr. F.O. Adams, Francis Ottewell Adams, in his History of Japan. He had previously been consul at Varna and Belgrade, and consequently had a sufficient experience of the system known as extraterritoriality, which in most non-Christian countries of the East exempts Europeans from the operations of the local law. In stature considerably less than the average Englishman, he wore a heavy grey moustache, and thin wisps of grizzled hair wandered about his forehead. Wonderful. His temper was sour and suspicious. Of his political capacity, there is not much to be said, except that he did not understand the circumstances amongst which he was thrown, as his dispatches sufficiently indicate, well written and incisive as they are. But this is only an example of the fact that power of speech with tongue or pen is not a measure of a man's fitness for the conduct of affairs. In his jovial moments, he easily unbent and would entertain his companions with snatches of operas, of which he carried a large assortment in his memory. At this period, he was about 55 and probably greatly affected with the beginnings of the disease which carried him off a few years later at Quito. Quito. The second in rank was the so-called Japanese secretary. He was neither a native of Japan, nor had he any knowledge of the language, so that the title must be understood as signifying, in quotation marks, secretary in charge of correspondence with the Japanese government. At our mission in China, there is always an official who bears the corresponding title of Chinese secretary, but there the post has always been held by a scholar. Dutch was the only European language of which the Japanese knew anything, and therefore, when the Foreign Office came to provide a staff of officials for the consular establishment, they sought high and low for Englishmen acquainted with that recondite tongue. 4 were at last discovered, one of whom was first appointed interpreter to the legation and afterwards accorded the higher title. Part of his salary was expressly granted by way of remuneration for instructing the student interpreters in the language of the country, and consequently could not be said to be earned. He retained his office for 8 years, when a consulate became vacant, and the opportunity was at once seized of, in inverted commas, kicking him up the ladder. All the domestic virtues were his, and of actively bad qualities he showed no trace. Next to this gentleman came a first assistant, sociable and accomplished, musical, artistic, and speaking many languages beside his own, but no lover of hard work. In his hands, the accounts fell 18 months in arrear, and the registers of correspondence were a couple of years behindhand. It was his function to preside over the chancery, and he left it to his successor in a condition which the latter aptly compared to that of an Aegean stable. He was the sort of man who is always known among his friends by his Christian name, and no higher tribute to personal qualities is possible. In the course of time, he became a consul and retired from the service at an early age, carrying with him the regrets and good wishes of everybody who knew him. In the legation staff, there were also included 2 doctors who at the same time discharged the functions of assistants in the chancery. One of them shortly quitted the service and set up in Yokohama as a general practitioner, to retire with a competent fortune after but a few years. The other merits more extended notice on account both of his character and public services of every kind. I mean my lifelong friend, William Willis. Perhaps no other man ever exhibited in a greater measure the quality which we are wont to call conscientiousness, whether in his private relations or in the discharge of his duties. Those who have had the fortune to profit by his medical or surgical aid feel that no man could be more tender or sympathetic towards a patient. He was devoted to his profession and lost no opportunity of extending his experience. In those days, a doctor had frequently to encounter personal risks, such as fall to the lot of few civilians. He exposed himself freely in order to succor the wounded. In the Chancery, his services were indispensable. He it was who swept the Aegean stable, arranged the archives in order, and brought the register up to date. Always on the spot when he was wanted, an indefatigable worker and unswervingly loyal to his chief. After 9 years' service, he was promoted to be a vice-consul, but by this time the Japanese had become so impressed with his value as a surgeon and physician that they begged him to accept a salary more than 4 times what he received from the Foreign Office, and he went where his great qualities were likely to be of more use than in trying petty police cases and drawing up trade reports of a city which never had any foreign commerce. His gigantic stature made him conspicuous among all the Europeans who have resided in Japan since the ports were opened, and when I first knew him, he was hardly 25 years of age. A man endowed with an untiring power of application, accurate memory for words and things, and brimful of stories, good stories from the 3 kingdoms. Oops, my alarm. Big men are big-hearted, and he was no exception. We shall come across him again repeatedly in the course of these reminiscences, and for the present, these few words must suffice. See also Sir Hugh Cortazzi's book about Willis. Besides these, the legation staff included Russell Brooke Robertson and myself as student interpreters, the 2 who had come over from Shanghai, Robertson and Sato, as we learned in the previous chapter. Last but not least were the officers of the Mounted Escort and Infantry Guard. The latter was commanded by Lieutenant Price of the 67th Regiment and was soon replaced by 50 Marines under the command of a man widely known in the service to which he belonged as Public-Spirited Smith. I shall say more of him later on. The cavalry escort consisted of a dozen men from the military train, a corps which went by the honorary title of pig drivers, and at their head was a lieutenant, a good harmless sort of fellow, whose only weakness was for fine uniforms and showy horses. Not being learned in the extremely complicated subject of military costume, full dress, half dress, and undress, I cannot say what it was that he had adopted for himself, but it was whispered about that he had been audacious enough to assume the insignia of a field officer, which is undoubtedly a serious offence against discipline. However, that may be. The blaze of gold which decorated his person was wonderful to behold, and on at least one occasion, when we were going in solemn procession to an audience of the tycoon, caused him to be mistaken for the envoy by the Japanese officials, who gave him the salutes that rightfully belonged to his less conspicuously adorned diplomatic chief. To determine whether the pleasure derived from this confusion of persons by the one outweighed the mortification, which might not unnaturally have been felt by the other, would have required a delicate moral balance, which was not available at the moment. It sounds like a kind of Benthamite calculus, doesn't it? Greatest happiness of the greatest number or something. But judging from the relative scale of the 2 men in other points of character, I am inclined to infer that the good preponderated largely over the evil, and that applying consequently the criterion so unfairly attributed to the utilitarians by their opponents, we must arrive at the provisional conclusion that the lieutenant's uniform was highly virtuous and worthy of the applause of mankind. But it is time to quit this gossiping tone and speak of more serious matters. And that's the end of chapter 2. Okay, on we go with chapter 3, political conditions in Japan. At this period, the movement had already commenced that finally culminated in what may fitly be called the Revolution of 1868, by which the feudal system was destroyed and the old monarchical government revived. The tendency of the times was as yet scarcely perceived by foreigners, with but 1 or 2 exceptions. They generally supposed that political strife had broken out between the sovereign and a few unruly vassals, dissatisfied with the treaties that permitted the sacred soil of Japan to be defiled by the footsteps of barbarians, and secured all the profits of trade to the head of the state, the vassals being enabled to defy their suzerain owing to his own feebleness and the incapacity of his ministers. It was still believed that the potentate in whose name the treaties had been concluded was the temporal sovereign, and that the Mikado was little more than the head of the priesthood, or spiritual emperor. This theory of the Japanese constitution was almost as old as the earliest knowledge of the country possessed by Europeans. Marco Polo, indeed, says nothing of its system of government in the 2 short chapters which he devotes to Zipangu, Z-I-P-A-N-G-U, Japan. But the Jesuit missionaries who labored in Japan during the 16th and 17th centuries uniformly held the Mikado to be a spiritual dignitary and spoke of the shogun as the real ruler of the country, the temporal king, and even emperor. Kempfer, that's K-A-E-M-P-F-E-R, Kempfer, the best known and most often quoted of the authorities on Japan, writing at the beginning of the 18th century, called the 2 potentates ecclesiastical and secular emperors. And his example had, up to the time I am writing of, been followed by all his successors without exception. The truth is that the polity of the Japanese state had assumed already in the 12th century the form which was still displaying at the beginning of the latter half of the 19th. And institutions which could boast of such a highly respectable antiquity might well be supposed to have taken a deep enough hold to be part and parcel of the national life. The history of Japan has still to be written. Native chronicles of Mikados and annals of leading families exist in abundance, but the Japanese mind is only just now beginning to emancipate itself from the thraldom of Chinese literary forms, while no European has yet attempted a task which requires a training different from that of most men who pursue an Eastern career. Until within the last 2 decades, the literature of Japan was almost entirely unknown to Europeans, and the existing keys to the language were ridiculously inadequate. The only historical works accessible to foreigners were the scanty Annales des Dairi, translated by Titsing, that's T-I-T-S-I-N-G-H, with the aid of native Dutch interpreters, and edited by Klaproth, that's K-L-A-P-R-O-T-H, with a degree of bold confidence that nothing but the position of a one-eyed man amongst the blind can give, and a set of chronological tables translated by Hoffmann, H-O-F-F-M-A-N, Hoffmann, for Siebold's Nippon, Siebold, S-I-E-B-O-L-D. It is no wonder, therefore, if at the outset of treaty relations, the foreign representatives were at a loss to appreciate the exact nature of the political questions that confronted them, and were unable to diagnose the condition of the patient whose previous history was unknown to them. To trace in detail the development of the Japanese monarchy from its beginnings as a pure theocracy of foreign invaders, attracting to itself the allegiance of a number of small tribal chieftains, the fusion of these tribes with their conquerors into one seemingly homogeneous race, the remodeling of the administration which followed upon the introduction of Chinese laws and philosophy, the supplanting of the native hero and native worship by the creed of Gautama, the rise of a military caste brought about by the constant warfare with the barbarous tribes in the east and north of the country, the rivalry of the Taira and Minamoto clans, both sprung from base-born younger sons of the Mikados, and the final suppression of the civil administration in the provinces by the distribution of the country amongst the followers of the Minamoto and their allies, would require a profound study of documents which no one has yet undertaken. What a long sentence, goodness. With the appointment of Yoritomo to be commander-in-chief, the feudal system was fully established. The ancient official hierarchy still existed at Kyoto, but in name only, exercising no influence whatever over the conduct of affairs. And in the 14th century, its functions were already so far forgotten as to become subject of antiquarian research. The civil and penal codes borrowed from the great empire of Eastern Asia fell into disuse, and in part even the very traces of them perished. Martial law reigned throughout the land. Half the people were converted into a huge garrison, which the other half toiled to feed and clothe. Reading and writing were the exclusive accomplishments of the Buddhist priesthood and of the impoverished nobles who formed the court of a Mikado, shorn of all the usual attributes of a sovereign, and a deep sleep fell upon the literary genius of the nation. The absence of danger from foreign invasion rendered the necessity of a strong central administration unfelt, and Japan under the shoguns assumed the aspect of Germany in the Middle Ages, the soil being divided between a multitude of petty potentates, independent in all but name, while their nominal head was little better than a puppet. This state of things lasted till the second quarter of the 14th century, when an attempt was made under the Mikado Go-Daigo to re-establish the pristine rule of the legitimate sovereigns. A civil war ensued that lasted for over 50 years, until the Ashikaga family finally established themselves in the office of hereditary shoguns. Before long, they split up into two branches which quarreled among themselves and gave opportunity for local chiefs to re-establish their independence. In the middle of the 16th century, a soldier of fortune, Ota Nobunaga by name, we normally say Oda Nobunaga, profited by the central position of the provinces he had acquired with his sword to arrogate to himself the right of arbitrating between the warlike leaders who had risen in every direction. After his assassination, a still greater warrior, known most commonly by the title of Taiko-sama, carried on the work of pacification. Every princelet who opposed his authority was in turn subdued, and he might have become the founder of a new line of maire du palais. He died, however, before time had sufficiently consolidated his position, leaving an inexperienced youth heir to his power under the tutelage of guardians who speedily quarreled. The most distinguished of these was Ieyasu, who, besides the vast domains which he had acquired in the neighborhood of Yedo, the modern Tokyo, possessed all the qualities which fit a man to lead armies and rule kingdoms. He had been Taiko-sama's sole remaining competitor for power, and at the death of the latter, naturally assumed the most prominent position in the country. A couple of years sufficed for the transference to him of all, and more than all, the authority wielded by his two predecessors. No combination against him had any chance of success. The decisive battle of Sekigahara in 1600 brought the whole nation to his feet, and he made full use of this opportunity to create checks upon the daimyos of whose fidelity he was not sufficiently assured by grants of territories to his own friends and followers, a few of the older families alone being allowed to retain their ancient fiefs. Among these were Shimazu in the south of Kyushu, Mori in the extreme west, and Date, Nambu, and Tsugaru in the northern provinces of the main island. His own sons received portions in Owari, Kishu, Mito, and elsewhere. In 1616, at Ieyasu's death, 19/20 of the whole country was held by his adherents. Thus there arose 5 or 6 classes of barons, as they may best be called, to render their position intelligible to the English reader. Firstly, there were the 3 families descended from his most favored sons, from whom, according to the constitution established by him in case of a default of direct heirs, the successor to the shogunate was to be chosen. As a matter of fact, resort was had only to Kishu when a break in the line occurred. Next came the related families, Kamon, sprung from his younger sons, and in the third place were ranked the lords of provinces, Kokushi. The members of these 3 classes enjoyed the revenue of fiefs comprising 1 or more provinces or lands of equivalent extent. Below them in importance were the hereditary servants, Fudai, and bannermen, Hatamoto, composed, as has been said before, of the immediate retainers of the Tokugawa family and the stranger lords, Tozama, relics of the former barons, who had submitted to his supremacy and followed his banner in his last wars. The qualification of a daimyo was the possession of lands assessed at a production of 10,000 koku, about 5 bushels of rice and upwards. The Hatamotos were retainers of the Tokugawa family, whose assessment was below 10,000 koku and above 1,000. Below them came the ordinary vassals, gokenin. The fiefs of all classes of the daimyos were in their turn at first partitioned out among their retainers and called kerai in their relation to their immediate lords, and baishin, arriere vassals, as being vassals of those who acknowledged the suzerainty of the shogun. Samurai and ashigaru denoted the 2 ranks of sword-bearing gentlemen and common soldiers among the retainers of the daimyos. In the end, every retainer, except the samurai of Satsuma, received an annual allowance of so much rice, in return for which he was bound to perform military service and appear in the field or discharge the ordinary military duties required in time of peace, accompanied by followers proportioned in number to his income. In Satsuma, the feudal subdivision of the land was carried out to the fullest extent, so that the vassal of lowest rank held the sword in one hand and the hoe in the other. No taxes were paid by any feudal proprietor. The kokushi and other barons of equal rank ruled their provinces absolutely, levying land tax on the farmers and imposts on internal trade as they chose. They had further the power of life and death, subject only to the nominal condition of reporting once a year the capital sentences inflicted by their officers. The other nobles were less independent. Every daimyo had to maintain an establishment at the capital, where his wife and children resided permanently, while the lord passed alternate years in Yedo and in his territories. That's the system of so-called Sankin Kotai. On his journeys to and fro, he was accompanied by a little army of retainers for whose accommodation inns were built at every town on the main roads throughout the country, and the expense involved was a heavy tax on his resources. A strict system of etiquette regulated the audiences with which the daimyos were favored on their arrival and departure, and prescribed the presents they were to offer as a symbol of their inferiority. There was little social intercourse among them, and they lived for the most part a life of extreme seclusion, surrounded by vast numbers of women and servants. A fixed number of hereditary councils, Karo and Yonin, checked all initiative in the administration of their fiefs. They were brought up in complete ignorance of the outer world, and the strings of government were pulled by the unseen hands of obscure functionaries who obtained their appointments by force of their personal qualities. After a few generations had passed, the descendants of the active warriors and statesmen of Ieyasu's time were reduced to the state of imbecile puppets, while the hereditary principle produced a similar effect on their counselors. Thus arose in each daimiate a condition of things which may be compared to that of a Highland clan, where the ultimate power was based upon the feelings and opinions of a poor but aristocratic oligarchy. This led to the surprising results of the revolution of 1868, when the power nominally exercised by the chief daimyos came to be wielded by the more energetic and intelligent of their retainers, most of whom were samurai of no rank or position. These men it was who really ruled the clan, determined the policy of its head, and dictated to him the language he should use on public occasions. The daimyo, it cannot be too often repeated, was a nobody. He possessed not even as much power as a constitutional sovereign of the modern type, and his intellect, owing to his education, was nearly always far below par. This strange political system was enabled to hold together solely by the isolation of the country from the outer world. As soon as the fresh air of European thought impinged upon this framework, it crumbled to ashes like an Egyptian mummy brought out of its sarcophagus. The decline of the Mikado's power dates from the middle of the 9th century, when, for the first time, a boy of 9 years ascended the throne of his ancestors. During his minority, the country was governed by his father-in-law, the chief of the ancient Fujiwara family, who contrived for a long period to secure to themselves the power of setting up and removing their own nominees just as suited their convenience. A similar fate befell the institution of the shogunate. After the murder of Yoritomo's last surviving son, the country was nominally ruled by a succession of young princes, none of whom had emerged from the state of boyhood when appointed, and who were deposed in turn after a few years of complete nullity, while the real heads of the government were the descendants of Hojo Tokimasa, Yoritomo's father-in-law. The vices of the hereditary principle in their case had again full sway, and the later Hojo were mere puppets in the hands of their principal advisors. The revolution in favor of the Mikado overthrew this system for a short interval, until the shogunate was restored for a time to reality by the founder of the Ashikaga family. But after the lapse of a few years, its power was divided between Kyoto and Kamakura, and the two heads of the family fell under the dominating influence of their agents, the Kwanrei, Uesugi, and Hosokawa. Towards the end of the Ashikaga period, the shogun had become as much an empty name as the Mikado himself, and the country was split up among the local chieftains. The bad condition of the internal communications between the provinces and the capital probably contributed to this state of things. Ieyasu was the first to render consolidation possible by the construction of good military roads. The governmental system erected by him seemed calculated to ensure the lasting tranquility of the country. But the hereditary principle again reasserted its influence. The third shogun, Iemitsu, was a real man. Born 4 years after the Battle of Sekigahara and already 12 years of age when his grandfather died in the year succeeding his final appearance in the battlefield, he had the education of a soldier, and to his energy was owing the final establishment of the Tokugawa supremacy on a solid basis. Ieyasu and his successor had always been in the habit of meeting the daimyos on their visits to Yedo outside the city. Iemitsu received them in his palace. He gave those who would not submit to their changed position the option of returning home and offered them 3 years for preparation to try the ordeal of war. Not a single one ventured to resist. But he was succeeded by his son Ietsuna, a boy of 10. During Ietsuna's minority, the government was carried on in his name by the Council of State, composed of hereditary servants, Fudai daimyos, and the personal authority of the head of the Tokugawa family thus received its serious blow. But worse than that, the office of chief counselor was from the first confined to 4 baronial families, Ii, Honda, Sakakibara, and Sakai. And the Roju, or ordinary councillors, were likewise daimyos. On them, the hereditary principle had, in the interval between the close of the civil wars and the accession of the 4th shogun, produced its usual result. Nominally, the heads of the administration, they were without any will of their own and were guided by their own hereditary councillors whose strings were pulled by someone else. The real power then fell into the hands of ministers, or bugyo, chosen from the hatamoto, or lesser vassals, and many of these were men of influence and real weight. Still with them, the habit of delegating authority into the hands of anyone of sufficient industry and energy to prefer work to idleness was invincible. And in the end, the dominions of the Tokugawa family came to be ruled by the okugoyu-hitsu, or private secretaries. Okugoyu-hitsu. The machine, in fact, had been so skillfully constructed that a child could keep it turning. Political stagnation was mistaken for stability. Apart from 1 or 2 unsuccessful conspiracies against the government, Japan experienced during 238 years the profoundest tranquility. She resembled the sleeping beauty in the wood, and the guardians of the public safety had a task not more onerous than that of waving a fan to keep the flies from disturbing the princess's slumbers. When her dreams were interrupted by the eager and vigorous West, the ancient, decrepit, and wrinkled watchers were found unfit for their posts and had to give way to men more fit to cope with the altered circumstances which surrounded them. Socially, the nation was divided into 2 sections by a wide gulf, which it was impossible to pass. On the one hand, the sword-bearing families or gentry, whose frequent poverty was compensated for by their privileges of rank. On the other, the agricultural, laboring, and commercial classes. Intermarriage was forbidden between the orders. The former were ruled by the code of honor, offenses against which were permitted to be expiated by self-destruction, the famous harakiri, or disembowelment, while the latter were subject to a severe unwritten law enforced by cruel and frequent capital punishment. They were the obedient, humble servants of the 2-sworded class. Japan had already made the experiment of free intercourse with European states in the middle of the 16th century, when the merchants and missionaries of Portugal were welcomed in the chief ports of Kyushu, and Christianity bade fair to replace the ancient native religions. They were succeeded by the Spaniards, Dutch, and English, the 2 latter nations confining themselves, however, to commerce. The gigantic missionary undertakings of the 2 great English-speaking communities of the Far West were the creation of a much later time. It will be recollected that in 1580, Spain for a time absorbed Portugal. The Roman Catholics began before long to excite the enmity of the Buddhist and Shinto priesthood, whose temples they had caused to be pulled down and whose revenues they seemed on the point of usurping. Nobunaga had favored them, but in the civil wars that raged at that period, the principal patrons of the Jesuits were overthrown, and the new ruler, Taiko-sama, soon proclaimed his hostility to the strangers. Their worst offense was the refusal of a Christian girl to become his concubine. Ieyasu, a devout Buddhist, pursued the same religious policy as his predecessor in possession of the ruling power. His dislike to Christianity was stimulated by the fact that some of Hideyori's adherents were Christians, and the young Prince Hideyori was himself known to be on friendly terms with the missionaries. The flame was fanned by the Dutch and English, now become the hereditary political foes of Spain, and the persecution was renewed with greater vigor than ever. Missionaries were sought out with eager keenness, and in the company of their disciples, subjected to cruel tortures and the most horrible deaths. The fury of persecution did not relax with Ieyasu's disappearance from the scene, and the final act of the drama was played out in the time of his grandson. An insurrection provoked by the oppression of the local daimyos broke out in the island of Amakusa, where thousands of Christians joined the rebel flag. After a furious struggle, the revolt was put an end to on the 24th of February 1638 by the assault and capture of the castle of Shimabara, when 37,000 people, 2/3 of whom were women and children, were put to the sword. It is hardly possible to read the native accounts of this business without a feeling of choking indignation at the ruthless sacrifice of so many unfortunate creatures who were incapable of defense and whose only crime was their wish to serve the religion which they had chosen for their rule of life. The Portuguese were forbidden ever to set foot again in Japan. The English had previously retired from a commercial contest in which they found their rivals too fortunate and too skillful, and the edict went forth that the Dutch, who now alone remained, should thenceforth be confined to the small artificial island of Deshima off the town of Nagasaki, where for the next 2¼ centuries, they and the Chinese were permitted to carry on a restricted and constantly diminishing trade. Attempts were made once or twice by the English and early in the present century by the Russians to induce the government of Japan to relax their rule, but in vain. The only profit the world has derived from these abortive essays is the entrancing narrative of Golovnin, who was taken prisoner in Yezo in connection with a descent made by Russian naval officers in revenge for the rejection of the overtures made by the Russian envoy Rezanov, perhaps the most lifelike picture of Japanese official manners that is anywhere to be met with. No further approaches were made by any Western government until the United States took the matter in hand in 1852. And that is the end of chapter 3. So I will stop the recording here and probably continue at another time. Thank you very much for listening and watching if you have been. Goodbye.